My name is Emily Hall. Today is Monday, October 30th, 2017, and I'm interviewing Rilla Askew for the Deep Roots Oklahoma Authors Oral History Project, sponsored by the Oklahoma Oral Research Program at Oklahoma State University. We're at Rilla's home today in Norman, Oklahoma. Rilla, your critically acclaimed work in fiction has won numerous awards. You've won the Oklahoma Book Award multiple times, the first in '93 for your collection of stories Strange Business, another in '98 for your debut novel, The Mercy Seat, and again in 2008 for your novel, Heart Song. In 2002, you won the American Book Award for your stunning novel, Fire and Beulah, which was about the Tulsa race riot, along with the Myers Book Award. Your short story, The Killing Blanket, was selected as an O. Henry Prize story in 1993. You were also inducted into the Oklahoma Writers Hall of Fame in 2002, and you won the Errol Gibson Lifetime Achievement Award for the Oklahoma Center for the book in 2011. You've just published a book of creative nonfiction, which is also outstanding, called Most American: Notes from a Wounded Place. These are only a few of your many accomplishments. I could keep going, but let's get started. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Poteau, Oklahoma, and I was born in Poteau because there was no hospital in the little town of Red Oak where my parents lived at the time. So Red Oak is about 30 miles west of Poteau, and my parents lived there we all lived there until I was about 3 and a half, and that's when we moved to Bartlesville, which is where I grew up. And I lived in Bartlesville from the time we moved there when I was 3 and a half until I graduated high school. Left there and never moved back.
Tell me about Poteau. You've written about its landscape and the people, or maybe even Red Oak too.
Yeah.
What stands out to you about that?
Well, I don't really write about Poteau itself as much. Poteau's where we go shopping and go eat wonderful steaks at Warehouse Willie's and do those things. But really the town of Red Oak is where my parents and my grandparents lived. It's where I spent all my summers when I was a kid. It's a little town of population about 300, 500. I don't know. It's really small. And it shows up in all my fiction as the fictional town of Cedar, which I've written about in not in every one of my books, but almost every one of my novels set in Oklahoma has this fictional town of Cedar. And so it's modeled on Red Oak. But because I didn't grow up there, but all my family's roots are there, going on back into Indian Territory time, not Red Oak and the environment around that area, Latimer County mostly. It's deeply, deeply embedded in my psyche and in my sense of self, much more than Bartlesville, even though that's where I spent all my high school years and all those grade school years. So my socialization happened in Bartlesville, my understanding of the social world in some way, but my family roots are what go deep in Red Oak and Latimer County. And that includes, by extension, Poteau, but it's really that little, which it's even more of a small town, and where everybody knows everyone, and all the histories of all the families. Mm-hmm. And it's in the valleys of the Samboy Mountains. So the Samboy are just to the north, the Kiamishi are just to the south, and yet the land right around Red Oak is in the valley, so it's not hilly, and so you see the mountains all around you, but you're in the flatlands, and I don't know, the memories of my grandparents and my great grandparents, the ones that I never even knew, are so steeped in that landscape that it's like my center of gravity. That's what my dad used to call it.
Oh, yeah, that's a good description. So it's a big contrast to Bartlesville, right?
Tell
me
is.
About Bartlesville and how it's different.
Well, Bartlesville is a company town. It was the headquarters of Phillips 66, and also at that time what became Citgo, what was City Service then. So there were two oil companies that were really prominent, and there were other big, important businesses, but those were the primary ones. And so a company town is a little bit like a university town in that everything sort of all revolves around that, and everyone, and there's a lot of social structure And I suppose there is that everywhere, but it seemed to me that it was really acute in Bartlesville. So we had a lot of advantages that that were the result of people coming in there to work for Phillips and for city service. But primarily by the time I was in high school, it was mostly just Phillips Petroleum. And there was a lot of money. So for education, we had really excellent public schools. We had it was voted an All-America city in 1963. But it was also there was also a great deal of segregation, and there was a great deal of racial prejudice, which was endemic to the era, the generation that I grew up in, and certainly to this whole part of the country. But it was acute in Bartlesville, and so I grew up very much conscious of those elements of segregation. And I came from the poor side of town. You know, my dad he worked for Phillips, but he was a pilot plant operator. He worked out at the research plant, and we grew up on the west side, and you know, we were not a part of what passed in Bartlesville for the elite. So I became, you know, we had to ride through areas of great poverty to go to the high school in the really nice section of town, and I think that marked me. And I mean, we were all doing it. Everybody who lived out in Oak Park, in the little housing addition, you know, where I grew up, did. But I'm not sure that everybody else had looked at it and said, "Whoa, what is this? Why is this?" And I'm not sure that I did very much at the time, but I certainly did later.
Yeah. I understand that your family considers you the family historian. Is that right?
They do.
Tell me about that. What fascinates you most about studying history?
That's interesting. I have a clock in my head. It's not really a clock. It's a map that tells me when events have happened. It used to be really, really keen. I think it's getting a little bit less keen as time goes on, but I can always relate something to something else. So one of the reasons they call me the family historian is because somebody will start talking about an event that happened in the family, and I'll say, "Oh yeah, that was 1994. Remember because," and then I start relating it to some other reason why I remember that it was 1994. So I have that sort of calendar going on in my head, and I also have this sort of it's a narrative. It's an ongoing narrative. It's probably a storytelling gene that makes me want to tell the stories, but also to relate the stories to the ongoing timeline that I understand, both of my family's narrative and my own narrative, and certainly I do that when I'm writing my fiction in terms of characters. So my older sister Ruth, talks about that she thinks compartmentally. So she'll have an acute memory, but she doesn't have it in relationship to everything else. For me, it's always on a continuum. So that's part of it. That's about being the family historian. Yeah. I don't know why I'm deeply interested in history. I don't think that I was not always. When I was in high school, I made decent enough grades in history and decent enough grades in English and terrible grades in math, but we can't all do everything. But I wasn't particularly fascinated with it until I began to write. And when I began to write, about Oklahoma, and I began to try to understand who we are as a people, I came to understand how many hidden histories there are in Oklahoma and how much we have not looked at the truth of our past. And so I think that history and mystery are completely joined together for me. And so that there's always the mystery of the past. There's always what we can't know. We can't know even our parents' lives. You know, they can tell us stories for when they were kids, and we can imagine it, we can see it, envision it in our minds, but we can't truly know the full depth and meaning of another individual's life, and we can't know who we are as a people unless we know the full depth of our story. And so I think it's trying to understand who we are now, and having come to understand that we cannot do that until we know who we have been, until we understand the full full forces that put me in a situation where I was living in a town where there was a great deal of wealth and a great deal of money and really good education and this incredible poverty. And I couldn't understand why that separation was there, why that segregation was there. And I couldn't understand all the forces that went into making that circumstance that I lived in then, decades ago, and that we live in now.
Did going back and researching your grandparents' history, or your learning more about your great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, give you any insight into
it did.
Mysteries?
I think it did, but the main thing that I found is that we can't know. So in my first novel, The Mercy Seat, there's a moment where the young girl Maddie she finds a tin box that was her mother's treasure, and she finds the items in the box, but she doesn't know what they meant to her mother's life, and her mother's already passed, her mother's died, and she comes to this great revelation that we can never know the truth of the past. So that's what I found when I was trying to go back and research my own people's story. So there are outlines, there are bold narratives that I can that I know now, because I was able to talk with one elder who, when he was a boy, sat around and listened to the old people tell the stories. But with every generation, those stories continue to get lost, or they get distilled, or they get they become just the bold outline, and then people become either all hero or all villain. It's either the skeleton or it's the forebear that we so revere, and so we can't know their lives in nuance. But I would say that when I first began to write, I did not know my family's story any more than I knew Oklahoma's story. And it was wanting to go back and write about those things that made me begin to trace that out. But of course, most of the elders were gone, and that's a sorrow that many people know, which is that none of us begin to be interested and start asking the questions until those who could answer the questions are already gone. Alas.
Yes. So I was wondering, when you were in high school, I think it was, what did you do in the summer times?
Go to Falls Creek?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure.
With the Trail of Tears.
Oh yeah, I know I wasn't in high school. I was in college. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. So after high school, I left Bartlesville, and I went and managed to make one semester at OBU and Oklahoma Baptist University in Shawnee. And I stayed in Shawnee for a couple of years and actually enjoyed myself, but but OBU and we didn't see eye to eye somehow. And I was just frankly too wild and couldn't settle down and couldn't get to class at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was just beyond me. So eventually I went back to school, and I went to school at Northeastern in Tahlequah. And so during those summers, while I was at a student at Northeastern, I danced at the Trail of Tears outdoor drama as an understudy dancer, and started out as a villager and then became an understudy dancer. And so that's, I've written actually quite a bit about that. It was the first that I began to that's a part of that coming to awareness. So I grew up in the dominant culture. I grew up white. I grew up in a very prejudicial era, and I grew up also with stories of being part Indian, part Cherokee on my father's side, and part Choctaw on my mother's side. Stories that are, that I didn't know then how common that story is, especially in Oklahoma, and but with no real connection to Native people except kids that I went to school with. So when I lived in Tahlequah and went to school there, and especially when I danced out at Trail, made a lot of really connections and really good friendships with a number of not just Cherokee people, but Native performers really from all over. And it was the first that I began to understand how we sentimentalize and stereotype and categorize and I think more than anything, because I had grown up in an era when we had Westerns and the Indians, as they were called, were always the villains. You might have, one Indian princess named Morning Star, one good chief. Everybody else were the how they were portrayed, and so that there was a real discrepancy between that and the people that I knew, and what I also felt was being done in that time was a kind of sentimentalization or an idealization of the Cherokee people that was not really from inside their own story, but it was a sort of an outside way of looking at it. It was a pageant, so pageants are always going to be in bold strokes. They're not novels, and they're not looking for nuance. But it was another time of illumination for me, for beginning to understand that there are ways that I've been told the stories of who we are and what Oklahoma is that are not really true, that are only true in the way that certain kinds of stereotypes are true, which is that they subscribe to some of the bold outlines, but they don't hold to the more difficult and complex truths.
Yeah, and learning those nuances is definitely hard to do, and that just made me think of your time in high school in 1969, where you interviewed James Brown.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So I was on the school newspaper staff, and we came from Bartlesville on a very cold night in January of 1969 down to the Tulsa Civic Center to interview James Brown, and that was set up by a fellow staffer, and I don't really remember the other things that we said, but the primary thing that I do remember is that we began to talk about integration. And so this is 1969. This was we were just a few years past Brown versus the Board of Education. We were supposed to be desegregated. We were supposed to be in that process of integration. And so I got into a discussion, I would say really an argument with James Brown, saying, because I had these sort of idealistic notions of what integration meant. And because I felt so segregated and so separated from any of the African American students that I went to school with. So we did go to school together, but we were not together. And the prejudice that was so endemic in the whole culture was there are also prejudices against other things, including poverty and including Native people and including, a lot of other elements of society, let me say, that in addition to African American, black-white prejudice, white-black prejudice, I guess you would say. But that was the dominant one in the civil rights era going up through the 1960s. And so I was of the mind, well, we just need to know each other. If we knew each other better, things would be better. And I had no idea about I didn't know about Jim Crow. I didn't really understand the economic inequities that are endemic to the whole American culture, were then, still are to this day. So I couldn't understand how simply us all getting to, going to school together and sitting next to each other in the classroom was not enough. And so, but he gave me to understand that I was wrong about this, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. It wasn't until years later that I began to grasp what he was talking about, which I think was primarily economic parity. Mm-hmm. And it still is that way today. I mean, those issues have not been really been addressed.
So didn't he say something to the effect of, "I'm successful because I'm James Brown"?
Yes.
The singer.
Yes, and he said, and I only know this not because I was able to hear him that night, but because this is what was in the newspaper article that we wrote for our school newspaper. He said, "I've made it because I'm James Brown, but I don't want to make it because I'm James Brown. I want to make it because I'm a man, And it is not that celebrity or talent or any of those other things that can allow one individual to break through a systemic economic barrier is not enough. So I think that's what he was saying.
Yeah. And we'll get back to those ideas in a minute, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you studied in college. Did you study theater? You wanted to become an actress?
Yes,
right?
yeah. Well, I started acting really in high school and junior high. I was in the school play every year, and I grew up Baptist. I grew up Southern Baptist, and so we were in GAs, and we were in every Christmas pageant, and I don't know. I was always up in front of people performing, and that really began in church. It began with junior memory work drill, where we would memorize verses of the Bible, and then we would hold the Bible down to it at our side, and then we would draw it like a sword, and then we would flip it open, and then but we had to have the verse memorized. So anyway, that's what we did. So I began that performing at a very young age. Then started doing school plays. And was by the time I finished high school, I had kind of a vague ambition, but everything was vague about me by the time I finished high school. All ambitions. I certainly didn't know that I wanted to write.
Yeah.
But I went to after my little brief stint at OBU. Then when I went to Northeastern, I was actually a special education major, which I liked very much. I did Special Olympics, and I liked it, but I didn't have a calling for it. So there was a time when I worked for the Cherokee County Health Department and the guidance center, and so I worked with special needs preschoolers, and I loved it, and I loved them, but it wasn't fully where my heart was. But I was a theater minor, and so I was always doing the plays, and when I didn't get cast, I was always heartbroken, and so I really my ambition kept going to theater, but my practical mind said, well, just become a special education teacher. So it got down to where I was 12 hours away from a degree. I just needed to do 12 hours on my student teaching, and I just quit school and went to New York. Well, there was a little 2-year stint there in Tulsa, but my hunger, I actually understand now, it was an artistic hunger. It was not just a hunger to act. It was a hunger to understand the world, and the hunger to understand the world through the lives of character, which is what the novelist does as well. But it's also what the actor does. And I liked performing, and I liked acting, and I still do it once in a while. But I didn't have that fundamental thing that I think is true for actors, which is that the need to embody character with my whole being. But I did need to embody character with my head, which is what fiction writers and lovers of fiction do, which is that we live the lives of other individuals through the written word, through that magic alchemy of those little scratches on a page, and then you just enter 19th century Russia, or you can go anywhere and live any life. So after I had moved to New York is when I began to write, sometime after I had moved there. But the initial impulse was to be an actor, and it was also to get out of Oklahoma.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that too, just that desire to, I don't know if escape's the right word, but maybe.
Yeah,
or just
I don't know if it was
out there.
There might have been a little sense of escape. I think that there was some element of that. It was far more hunger to go to. I wanted to know what the world was. I wanted to know New York City. I had spent quite a bit of time in California, going back and forth. I had a boyfriend who was from there, and so I wanted to know how other people in the world lived, and I eventually wanted to go, travel to Europe and other places as well. But mostly, I did not want to. My roots were really tied here, and so I never, when I was thinking about wanting to leave, as I said, it was to go to, but it was never to abandon what was here. So the very first thing that I did when I made the decision to move to New York was to drive out to Tulsa International Airport and get a round trip ticket to come home for Christmas. This was in the fall, it was just before Thanksgiving. So I knew that Oklahoma held me. And part of that's my family, which I'm very, very close to, and my parents and my sisters. But part of it is just Oklahoma, and it's It's the physical world of Oklahoma. It's the people of Oklahoma. It's the sights, the smells. I can't, it's the sky, it's the wind, it's the landscape, the multiple landscapes that have always held me. But I didn't think that at the time. I just thought that if I don't go now, I'll never go, for one thing. Mm-hmm. And if I don't go, I'll never know. And so I had to go live very, very different life in Manhattan for a number of years, and then in Brooklyn for a number of years, and then in the Catskill Mountains for a number of years before I would come full circle and be ready to come back.
What did you miss? You kind of talked about this a little bit. I'm just thinking
Mm-hmm.
of transitioning from Oklahoma to New York City
Mm-hmm.
and just how different that must have been. Did you feel homesick a lot, and maybe how did you deal with that, or it was just like...
No, I didn't. I don't think I felt homesick at all till I moved to the Catskills. But I mean, it's, living in Manhattan is just too exciting, and because I never cut ties, because I always came home when I couldn't afford my rent, I'd still find enough money to get home for a trip, at least a couple of times a year. Mm-hmm. And but I don't think I felt any real sense of homesickness, because what I had gone to was also a part of me. After I'd been there not very long, I met the man who became my husband, and so there was that love. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of other things that held me there. And then when I moved to Brooklyn, I loved Brooklyn even more than Manhattan. Manhattan was exciting, and it was, I lived in the theater district, and I worked in the theater district, and all my friends were actors, and it was a really, really exciting time. But then when we moved to Brooklyn, it answered another part of me, which is being in touch with people from all over the world, because Brooklyn is the world. So you just go from one neighborhood, and you're in Jamaica in one neighborhood, and then you go a little ways and you're in Russia. It's so gorgeously mixed. And I began to go to school at Brooklyn College, and that's when I began I studied creative writing and studied fiction writing, and began to really get my craft skills and my sense of who I am as a writer began to develop during that period of time. But also an even broader sense of what it means to be a human and a citizen of the world that happened while I was there in Brooklyn. So my homesickness began when we moved to the Catskills, because we moved out to the country. It was very, very rural. It was not very culturally mixed. It was pretty white. And I couldn't see the horizon. It was the mountains. It was dark. I just felt like I couldn't even stand up straight. I couldn't see the sky. I couldn't see. I mean, you feel that in the canyons of the city, but you can go over the west side and look across the river, and there's sky. You can go to Central Park. There was no place I felt that I had no vista. And I mean, there were all kinds of, it's a long, complicated life. So there are all kinds of other things that were going on. But that's when I barely began to write my way back home. That's when I began to write The Mercy Seat. And that's when the fullness of the understanding of homesickness and the pull of home began to really happen for me. Would that have happened in the same way if I'd stayed in the city? I don't know. It's hard to say, because it wasn't there when I was in the city. It was there when I moved to the mountains.
So Paul, your husband, he was one of your first readers, or is he still one of the first readers of your work? With
yes, yeah. He's really the first person who said to me, kids, you really can write. And who really, he encouraged me when he very first saw any of my writing to put my artistic energy in that area, which I have to say. And he is a wonderful acting teacher, as well as an actor and director and other things. But he had his own acting studio in Manhattan, the Image Theater and Studio, and one of the best acting teachers around. And he saw some of my acting, and he didn't really encourage me to act.
Is that how you guys met in class?
No, we didn't meet in class, but I did see about going to study with him, but he told me I shouldn't study with him because he was too crazy about me. So I never was his student, and never studied with him. I would have no doubt been a better actor if I had. But no, we met through theater friends in the theater district after I'd been in New York like 1 week. So,
Wow.
So yeah, but he's not only a man of the theater, but he's also an artist in so many levels. He's also a poet, and he also has a great appreciation for the visual arts and for all of the arts, and certainly for the written word. So I think that he saw what was the strongest impulse within me. And so he's encouraged me from the very beginning. I've had a lot of encouragement from other friends and family, but he's the first one who validated for me and who said you can do this, which is the very first thing that we need as aspiring artists or aspiring anything, right? Mm-hmm. But it is for someone to validate and say, yes, this thing that you think you want to do, you can do this, and that the critique that he gave me, because he's a teacher and he's just very naturally had all kinds of things to say to the very first lengthy story that I wrote and gave to him. And I remember at the very end of it, I just looked at him with tears in my eyes and I said, "Don't you like any of it?" That was after I had begun to write seriously. It's not the first thing where he had just seen something I wrote and said, "You should write."
You have to really trust.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I also didn't know how to take criticism. I didn't know how to take critique. So we need both as especially when we're starting out, or when we have that secret ambition. I mean, I wasn't young. I was like in my late 20s when we met, and early 30s when I got really serious about writing. And so you need both of those things. You need encouragement, but just blanket encouragement is no more helpful than blanket discouragement, because you have to find a way to get better. And so I actually got both of those things in one package.
Yeah, that's great. How did you learn how to take criticism in your work as you went through your MFA program and maybe after?
Yeah, you just have to do it very, very quickly. And that's one of the good things I think about an MFA writing program. So you're in writing workshop, and you've brought in your story, and everybody gives you feedback on the story, and you don't speak. You don't have the opportunity to speak. You just listen to everybody talking about your piece. So that's difficult, but it's also it really helps you. It helps you get dispassionate about it. And and the initial impulse always is to be defensive and to defend the work and say, well, you don't understand, and so forth. But you learn very quickly, because that's the culture of workshop. No, you just simply don't answer back, and then you begin to learn to hear what makes sense to you in terms of the critique. Sometimes it takes sometimes like 2 or 3 weeks or even longer before you kind of go, you know what, I think she's right. But the culture of the workshop, I'm doing this because it's like at a big table like this and everybody's sitting around, and so before my story was ever up, I was able to watch other writers bring their life's blood, their baby in, and listen to everybody talk about it, and watch them buck up and listen to very carefully and say at the very end, "Thank you very much." Although there's usually most workshops, there's an opportunity for the writer to speak at the end of it. So I think that anyone who seriously wants to get better at what they do is always willing to take critique. Athletes do it all the time. Musicians do it all the time. It's I don't think it's easy for anyone, but I think all of us who are really serious about it learn to stuff the ego in order to get better at what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So when did you start thinking of yourself as a writer?
It was pretty early on when I was after. So Paul encouraged me to write. I was writing some plays. That's what the first thing that I began to write, which sort of was a natural segue from theater, and also that everyone that I knew was in theater. Almost everybody was an actor, aspiring actor. I might have known 2 directors, maybe 1 playwright. Almost everybody else was an actor. So that was sort of natural. And but then I really quickly began to write fiction because that's what I love to read. So I read plays if it was for an audition or if it was good, but I didn't read plays for pleasure. I read fiction for pleasure. So very quickly I started writing an autobiographical story, as we often begin, something that happened when I was a child, and I was so amazed to find that I could do it. I would show it to just anybody. I was just like, hey, I can do that. But I was writing in a vacuum, and I did not have community because all of my community was theater. And so eventually, after we'd moved to Brooklyn, when I went to Brooklyn College, I found a community of other writers, fiction writers. And I also write creative nonfiction and have tried my hand at other forms. But my first love, and I think it will always be so, is fiction and primarily novels. So I think I had always still been saying I don't think I would say I want to be a writer. I would say I want to write. But the fact is I was writing. And then the very first semester I was there, developed a friendship with a wonderful writer named Jessica Treat. And so we both came in January, in the middle of the year. So she and everybody else had been in the workshop together for, it was the end of their second year. And she had not been published. She'd been knowing since she was 9 years old that she was going to be a writer. And she just said, I am a writer. And I said, well, if she's a writer, I'm a writer. So I really adopted it. I mean, it was an affirmation that she just had inside her. She knew she was a writer. She did not have to have that external validation of being published to be convinced. And so I appropriated it. I just borrowed it. And it, and I never doubted, actually, that I would be published. I never doubted that the work, I never said, I want to do that. I just said, I'm doing this, and that will happen. I'm writing this. And that's actually how I began to write in the first place. Because I was in theater, and you have to have the job in order to practice your art. I mean, you can go to acting class and do scenes and so forth, but if you're really going to act, you have to have all of the trappings. You have to have the job, and otherwise you can't do it. But nobody can stop you from writing. You just need a notebook and a writing utensil. Now we think we all need to have laptops, but you don't really have to. And I said, I can do my art. I can do what I want to do, and nobody can stop me from doing it. And it never occurred to me that the end result of that would not be being published and making books. So I perhaps was naive, but that was a good naivete.
Yeah, that's good to have. So when you did start publishing your work, The Gift, that was a short story, right, that you published in Nimrod. What was that experience like?
I try, as I try to think of it, I try to remember. I don't want to sound too overly confident, but it just seemed like the next proper step. So I didn't have a sense of oh my God, I finally got published. It was just like, well, I finally got published. Now, on to the next thing. So the things that I really liked about it, it was actually an Oklahoma Indian Markings issue of Nimrod. And it was my introduction to a lot of Native writers whose work I didn't know. And so there were. That was the first time I ever read a Joy Harjo poem. Was in that same collection, and so that's a whole different narrative. That was a kind of an opening up or a connection that exists to this day. That's a really important part of my experience as a writer and as an Oklahoma writer, and of coming to understand myself. But the act of simply being published, I was sending out to a lot of journals. It just happened that was the very first one, and then I got another story published within a few months more after that at literary journals and so forth. So it was exciting, but it was I wasn't surprised at it. And I when I look back now, when I know how difficult it is to get published and difficult to get books published. And looking always to encourage, young writers and so forth. Sometimes I think, gosh, it was so easy. It was way easier than it seems to be today. But then I guess that's just great good fortune. I don't know.
Yeah. So the first collection of short stories that you published, the book Strange Business, had a short story in it called The Killing Blanket.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me about the narrator for this story?
Oh yeah, so that's a first person narrator, and when I was a kid, in the bank in Red Oak, there was a photograph of the last official Choctaw execution of a man named Silan Lewis. And at the photograph is him on the ground, and you can't really see his face. And kneeling beside him are some Choctaw light horsemen, and the man who was the sheriff, who is looking up towards the camera, and my recollection is that he has on a white hat. It's a very famous photograph. It's easy for people to find it in archives and so forth. But I was always fascinated with that. And that happened, actually, I thought it happened in Red Oak. It turns out it wasn't. It was probably more likely down by Cravens, which is a little community not far from Red Oak. But it was the last legal execution in Choctaw Nation. When I started writing about it, I thought that I would write he was married to a white woman. And as happened with the Choctaws in those days, when they were sentenced to death for a crime, they would give them the opportunity to go home and get a crop in and take care of all of their business, and then they would come back to the execution place. And that's what happened with Silan Lewis. He was sentenced to death. He went home, took care of all of his business, I think for a matter of several months, and then came back to be executed. And he was married to a white woman, and so that cultural difference. And so I thought I would write it from the wife's point of view, in the wagon, driving with her husband to his execution. What would that be like? But then when I started writing it, it was just a different voice that came to me. So the narrator's voice is actually, as I hear it in my head, an elderly Choctaw man who's talking about his grandfather was Tecumseh. For some reason, his last name is escaping me, who was the sheriff, who was the man who actually, because the first shots did not kill Silan Lewis, they had to suffocate him. And so it was his friend who had to put a handkerchief over his mouth and suffocate him until he died, which is a tragedy that's also a part of that that whole narrative. So sometimes people think that because the narrator in first person says, my grandfather told me this story, thinks that it's me, and it's not me. It's the voice that I just heard, as I often hear voices.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you kind of go back to some of your acting skills, and maybe you're not embodying the character like an actor would embody the character, but what helps you see from this character's point of view?
I think it is a lot of that. It's not, like you said, it's not really embodying with the full, but it is embodying with sound and with the sound of voices. And I'm not sure. I think the facility for that was easier when I was younger. I think it gets harder to hear the voices. Or it may be, I'm not really quite sure what all that is, but I know that early on, I would either hear a narrative voice that's just telling me this. It's still a storytelling voice, but it's not the I narrator. It's a third person narrator, sort of, that will give me the first line of a story, and that same voice will help me tell the whole story. And but it's really true for first person that it's always a character. I think a lot of fiction writers will tell you this. It's not like an auditory hallucination or anything, right. But your characters speak to you. You can. It's a rhythm. It's an internal rhythm of sound that allows all that to bloom in dimension, and then we translate it into these little symbols that we put on the page, and then that gets retranslated when somebody reads it, when the reader reads it, and. So I think, that my novel, The Mercy Seat, there's a whole section called Plain Chant. I wrote it, but I forgot which I titled it. I went back and forth between Plain Song and Plain Chant several times. And I think it's called Plain Chant, which is multiple voices all it's like a sort of Rashomon effect about different voices telling their part of bearing witness to a particular event that happened. And I did not intend to do that. It's just that when I started trying to just, tell about this particular event, which is a shooting that happens, I just kept hearing all these different voices telling about it. So I just followed the voices.
Great. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, and I wanted to have a chance to talk about Travis and Marlene that you mentioned in your new book, Most American. How did you meet this family?
Okay, so we're talking about my godson Travis, his mom Marlene, and he also has two younger sisters, Ebony and Essie, who are also my godchildren. And Marlene was one of my students when I was teaching at Brooklyn College. And so she just became a special student to me. And when she was out, no longer my student, but was going to have her son, she asked me to be godmother to her son. So after some kind of wondering, should I do this? Should I not do this? Because I mean, she was my student, but I didn't know her really, really well. And I wasn't sure even, you know, it's raised Baptist, we don't have godparents. I don't really know what it even meant, you know. Yeah. And, but I said yes. And so they have become, they're like my adoptive family, you would say. I mean, in a metaphorical sense. They're of Jamaican descent. Marlene was, of course, born in Jamaica. Travis was born here, and the girls were born here. So our lives have been, you know, completely intertwined for almost 30 years now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What was it like meeting her family for the first time?
The first time I met her family was when I went to her shower, and they lived in a part of Brooklyn that's just completely the West Indian district, and so over on Snyder, and so when I went there, it was an apartment with I think 6 adult grown children and like 2 or 3 little ones, and so the matriarch is Mama. And she brought her kids up here from Jamaica when Marlene was I think she was 9 or 13. I can't remember which. More like 13. And and these are her siblings, and everybody else still lived together. But I had never been in any African American home or West Indian home. I mean, I had no idea. I was really I could have been in another country for how unfamiliar everything seemed to me. But they just welcomed me and, got me a wine cooler and set me down to the Bob Marley, and that was good.
Yeah, that's great. What was Travis or the other kids, what were they like as a baby or as teenagers? You kind of watched them
grow up. Yeah. Well, just perfect. Yeah. No, so I don't know what you would say. Just they're like my kids, you know. They're I mean they're not my kids, but they're the children, even more than my nieces and nephews. They're the children whose lives who I've taken care of more, and I've been more involved with their young lives than you know. In part because I was in New York and my nieces and nephews were here, but also it's so much of that has to do with Marlene herself. She just brought me in as family. I became family. Travis would come over and spend the night with me from the time he was 8 months old. He would just come stay a whole day and a night and a day, and the kids have always just come to stay with me, and I don't know. I don't really know how to answer that. They're just beautiful, beautiful. Now they're getting all grown up. Travis is he's a dad, and he's got a beautiful little girl, and he's 27, and Ebony's in college, and Essie's in high school, and they're just living.
We have hopes and dreams and fears for our children. What are some of the hopes, dreams, or fears that you have for your godchildren?
Well, all the challenges that any person of color, but especially African American people, face in this country, I fear those things for for the girls in their way, for the things that threaten African American women. Threaten, that's not the right word. It feels like it's so complex. It's hard for me to just say this. The layers and layers of life challenges of what it means to walk through America with brown skin, and so. The girls are doing great. They have such great support from their family. They're talented. They're great girls. They both love to act, and they both love to, especially Essie, the youngest one, does. And Ebony's a musician, and they're Travis works in construction and raises his daughter, and they just live a life. But he's anytime they're driving in a car and they see lights flashing behind them, something bad can happen. And I know that anywhere you go, where they happen to live, the part of Brooklyn that they live in, and all of those things, you'd think that there would be some degree of insulation, but there's not from the inherent racism that is America. So, and I've written about this, and that's, I think, why you're asking me about them, that I've seen. Witnessed incredible, especially for Travis, racial profiling for him as a young man driving. Things that have happened also to his stepfather Errol, and so there's always that potential for violence, and so I've been able to see that firsthand, and to recognize how deep and how true it is. I remember Marlene saying to me one time, when Travis was by then already about like 22. That's what she said. She said, he's 22 years old, and every time he goes out the door, I'm afraid for his life. That's the truth. So yeah, you have hopes and dreams, and you want the same things that you want for anybody you love, which is happiness, and hopefully good marriage, and if that's what you want, and good work, and love, and prosperity, and all those things. But to be safe is one of the primary hopes that I think we have, in these times that we live in. I think about this for my nieces as well, who are growing up white in America, but it's just much more acute. The dangers are greater.
Kind of thinking of Fire in Beulah. It's about the Tulsa race riots. And what that book did, and what it does, and what it says about race and history. Do you think that fiction can teach us empathy, and can the ability to do that affect any kind of change?
I think fiction absolutely can. I think it taught me that. I think that's what that any sense of what I came to know about what it means to be other than just growing up a young white girl in middle America, came because of reading. It began very early on because of reading. You can get it somewhat through music, and you can get it somewhat through film and through other art forms, but I think fiction does it more viscerally than any other art form. And I think that fiction can do this. And it's one of the reasons. I've had a discussion recently with my sister Ruth about the need to. I'm working on a novel right now, and she's like, forget the history. I go, I can't forget the history. That's that sometimes in order to make the art, you have to jettison the history. But I also think that, especially when we're writing about things that are as fraught as something as what we call the Tulsa race riot, which was really, that's a misnomer. As we know, it was not really truly a riot, but it was an assault by the white community on the black community. But you have to try to get you have to try to uncover the history and get it as clear as you can in terms of what happened. But the imagining happens within the characters, and the imagining happens within coming to live someone's life. And I did have, early on when that book was first published, I had several white women who read it, middle-aged white women, who said to me, I feel as if I understand racism and segregation for the first time from reading that book, which is a really powerful thing to say. And of course, what my first response is, if you were reading Toni Morrison, or if you were reading Alice Walker, or if you were reading James Baldwin, this would not be the first time you would have read that. But it just happened that, they read it. They weren't all Oklahoma women. There were a couple in Oklahoma, and there was at least two in upstate New York. It's just circumstantial. I don't know. They picked it up not because they were particularly interested in Oklahoma history, not because they were particularly interested in issues of race, but because they liked good novels and because they had read some of my other work or something. So I think that fiction absolutely can do that, and it's done it for me. But I think that it only works if it's not a polemic, if it's just about what it means. If it's just about what it means to be human, if it's honest, if it's not sentimental, and if it doesn't try to whitewash. That just makes me think of something. I've been rereading, it's a total aside, we can cut this one out if you want to, but I've been rereading Hilary Mantel's books about Thomas Cromwell, who has been vilified so much through history, and she has given us a Cromwell that we can deeply identify with, and she's really humanized him. Mm-hmm. It's just a great, it's a great feat. But I just now realize, because he really was, it was really terrible what he also held the power over. I mean, there was a kind of ruthlessness as well. And I was just thinking, do I know his ruthlessness from these books? I'm going to have to think about that.
When you mentioned ruthlessness, it just made me think of what you wrote in your latest book, where you said Oklahoma is a wounded place. The country as a whole is wounded. Can you tell me more about this? What do you mean?
Well, I think what I mean about that is very specifically the wound of racism. Yeah. And I take that from Wendell Berry's wonderful book, The Hidden Wound, where he's talking about racism in America. So I think that it's the story of race and what we call race, which is, we know that race is not even an actuality. It's a social construct. Yet it is it's at the very core of this nation because of our legacies of genocide of the Native Indigenous people here, and also because of slavery. And we have gone, from that, it branches out into the kind of racism that anti-Asian sentiment. Every wave of newcomers. So, I think it was the Irish that came before the Italians, or was it the Italians that came before the Irish? But whoever the new wave was, then that bumped up the next layer, I guess you would say, so that racism is tied to how we view the other, and that the other is a threat. But because of the nature of skin color being so much a part of what has been wrought here because of chattel slavery, where we brought Africans, and that was the mark of slavery. We all know that slavery goes all the way back to the very beginning of man's beginnings, and it continues to this day in sex trafficking in all kinds of ways that slavery endures. But because the narrative here was all about race and skin color, and it still is. And so that's the wound that hasn't healed, and it hasn't healed because we've never owned it. It's not been, it can't be cauterized because we just keep covering it up, keep covering it over. And so I think that's the thing that I'm talking about, that for people who care about these issues or who pay a lot of attention to these issues. We just know that this is so, and that it is not better. And in this particular political climate that we're in here in 2017, we understand how close to the surface race hatred is, and so that, you know, and it can be anti-Semitism. I mean, it manifests in lots of forms, but in this country, it is really tied to skin color, and because I was so raised in an era of such extreme segregation, and where the nature of skin color also made a difference, even about the layers of racism. That I remember that there were like certain Native American kids who were more accepted, but they had lighter skin color, and so they were mixed, and so those elements were accepted without my thought when I was a kid. Now I think about them all the time, and I don't know. We're still pretty wounded. I don't know how we're gonna. But I do. There's a lot of change. You know, there's a lot of change in the hearts and minds of people from the dominant culture. That's something that I really see. So yes, we're living in a particular political moment when we see how overt, how much racism is still here. That was perhaps subsumed a little bit from the 1990s up through the early 2000s. That's all that mask has just been ripped away. So we know the authenticity of it, but we also have, I think, not only a younger generation that is raised with less indoctrination than my generation was, but we also have, I mean, I'm just thinking of a number of people that I know, women of my generation, men as well as perhaps, but it happens that I talk to more women, in part because that's really who my reading audience is. When I go to book clubs or when I go to libraries, there will often be some men there, but it's mostly women. And this particular book, Most American, has garnered a lot of really, or given an opportunity for some really interesting conversations. What happens is when I go to a reading group or a bookstore and we start talking, people start telling their stories. So it's not me just presenting my story of, you know, growing up in the dominant culture in that era of extreme segregation. It's other people saying the same thing and saying, you're saying what I never wanted to say. I didn't want to tell how, not only how I was taught, but how I felt. Why did I not think about this? Why did I not understand how wrong this was? And how do I fix it now? And I see a lot of frustration sometimes with I would just say, you know, white people of good heart who really don't know how to change things. But that's different than the era that I grew up in. So that's a very positive movement, but it's not enough yet.
So maybe slowly America and by extension Oklahoma, because I think like you said, Oklahoma is kind of like a microcosm of American culture at large. Very diverse. Maybe we'll learn from our mistakes. Wanted to switch topics a little bit and talk about the Dust Bowl for just a second. You know, a long time ago, George and I think Steinbeck was around giving a talk, and he said something to the effect of that Steinbeck gave Oklahoma its image that to this day holds us back. So when you're writing Heart Song, did you have that kind of in mind, that stereotypical image of Dust Bowl and Oklahomans that maybe you wanted to tell a different sort of story? Because your book's totally different. Yeah.
I do think, I think to a degree George Nye is right in that I think Oklahomans, if not the rest of the world, certainly Oklahomans have internalized that image of the Jodes and the Okies from Grapes of Wrath. Again, I think that was more true for a younger generation than it necessarily is now. But I think that my beef with John Steinbeck, who I think is an amazing writer, and there's so many things that I like about Grapes of Wrath. In particular, there's some interstitial chapters that just like have the voice of God in them, and I just think they're beautiful. But I never felt that he really understood Oklahomans at all. Mm-hmm. And so there are elements that have to do with the language. I mean, just listening to those voices that he just simply doesn't get right. And so using phonetic spelling, for instance, to try to get the voices of the Jodes makes them look even more uneducated than they might be. So he might give them a deep nobility, but he also diminishes them in some kind of way. I don't think that was his intention. I just think it's the result of that. And I think that, so I think I was always looking to try to tell a truer story of Oklahoma at that time, and a truer story of who Oklahomans are. So that's really what I was looking at with Harp Song. I wanted it to be, I think I wanted to try to tell, I had just finished Fire and Beulah when I started writing it, and I wanted to tell a kinder, gentler story about us. Don't think that I really achieved that, but that was the goal. But you can't do it without sentiment. So, some of us are just mean as a snake. That's just how it is. But if you don't have some meanness, you don't have a really good story. So.
Right. So how do you feel about the word Okie?
I'm fine with it. I don't have any particular desire to claim it. To reclaim it and to say, you use this to disparage us, now we will claim it and use it as our own in defiance. But I'm frequently say things like, it's an Okie deal. And not usually saying that in a flattering way.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like, I don't know how they lay out the highways and the on-ramps and off-ramps, and I just go, it's an Okie deal.
It's like Tulsa.
Yeah, yes. Or some other things when I just like, to people who are not, my husband's a Yankee, and sometimes I just say, honey, it's an Okie deal, you just wouldn't understand. And you go, after 35 years, I think I understand. So no, you don't.
So let's talk about your writing process for a minute. Can you take me through your process from first draft to final draft?
I'm an inveterate reviser. And I wish I had Anne Lamott's ability to write. She doesn't use the word crappy, but she uses another word for first drafts. But I don't. I rework it as times goes on. So I have to write far enough into, this is for novel, I have to write far enough into the novel that it sort of reaches critical mass, so that I feel like I feel as if I have the characters, I have the central movement of the book, and I certainly have location and place and era and all the other things that you need. But then I can only go so far, and then things change, as you progress, and you're writing it over the course of months and sometimes years and sometimes many years. And then I have to go back to the beginning and sort of comb through and make it all fit up again, and then reach that point again, and then go forward another 100 pages or so. I don't recommend this method to anyone. Mm-hmm. It's just what I do. But on the other hand, by the time I finish, I have pretty much a finished draft of the novel with some tweaking, as opposed to writing just to sort of blurt it out entirely, first draft.
The national novel writing month.
Right. Just throw it, and that can work for some people. And then you go. I know people who write 8, 9 drafts of a novel, and it's just not what my method is. I do have to hear a voice, and I have to have a kind of language to tell it. But almost always there's a central issue there's a question, there's something that I want to get at that is an abstraction. Not that I don't know the answer to. And it's not as if I begin the novel and say, here's this question that I'm trying to answer. But intuitively I feel that way about it, that there's something that I don't understand that I'm writing my way toward understanding. And usually I think by the end of it, intuitively, I know what that is, although if somebody asked me to write that aloud, I'd have to think about it quite a bit before I can articulate what it is.
So what's a productive day look like for you? So you do a lot of research, and there's just a lot that goes into writing a novel.
Yeah, well, it's I have to say it's been different with every book, and it depends on how much historical research is involved. When I started writing about the Tulsa race riot, as we call it, I didn't know anything about it, but I also didn't know anything about Oklahoma's history, and that was really the beginning. I had written Strange Business, which was a collection of stories that's even though the characters are not grounded in my life, the places and the era were all grounded in my life, and so I didn't have to do a lot of research for that. But when I wanted to write about the events of the Tulsa disaster, I had to do all kinds of research, not only just about what happened with that, but I mean, how people lived on an everyday basis, because that's what you do with fiction, is that you paint the picture for the reader so that the reader is there on, in the room with your characters. And so you have to know what the room looks like, and you have to know whether they had hot and cold running water, and how did they get around, and how did they eat, and what did they eat, and, all kinds of things that I had no idea about. And I also knew nothing about how African-American people came to be in Oklahoma. That was not part of any of my Oklahoma history at all. When I look back at the holes in what I was taught about who we are and how we came to be here, so that was a huge one. And so I certainly knew about slavery, and I knew about the Civil War, and I knew about the Trail of Tears, and I knew about the land runs. But I didn't know how it happened that all these Black people lived on the west side of Tulsa. of Bartlesville. Where did they come from? How did they get there? They didn't, they didn't come on the Trail of Tears. Well, as a matter of fact, some of their ancestors might have, There are all kinds of things that I didn't know about Black history that I had to educate myself about. But then in other books, it's been different. Sometimes, like with my novel Kind of Kin, which is set in 2008, I didn't have to do historical research. I had to do some research about how laws are made and, things that go on up at the Capitol. But it's set in a place that is very familiar to me. It's set, it's types of characters that are very familiar to me. So I didn't have to do that. It was mostly again, listening to the characters. And when I started the novel, I thought it was going to be in the little boy's point of view. And he starts the book, but then very quickly his Aunt Sweet comes in and just basically sort of takes over the book. And points of view often change, characters change for me, and I just have to follow it more than I organize it from my conscious mind. I have to surrender to it and work every day. That's one of the main things for writing a novel, is to make sure that you leave it for one, it leaves you for two, as I've heard said, or 2 days away. 1 day away means 2 days back, and it's true. So I have to get up early. I have to go straight to the computer, write first, and no phone, no Facebook, no New York Times, no, none of that. Or else I don't write, because if the world comes in first, it doesn't happen.
So what's the best piece of writing advice that you've ever received from someone else?
Well, this one actually is from John Steinbeck. So we'll tip our hat to him. He says, you have to give up the notion of ever finishing. And that's one that I use. I mean, there are so many wonderful, wonderful quotes about writing from writers. But that's one that when I'm working on a novel, I have to absolutely hold to, because you're always trying to get to the end, and they take me years to finish. And so I have to say, okay, this is what I'm working on today. And the middle of a novel, as we know, sometimes as readers, the middle of a novel can sag. For writers, the middle of a novel really sags. That's what you could maybe fix in revision. But you start out and get like gangbusters, and then and the end, when it's a sprint to the end, when you get there. But that middle part, you're like a yeoman. You're just like putting one foot in front of the other one. You're just like. And I'm not going to look at the end, and I'm not going to look at reviews in my head, and I'm not going to do any of those other things. I'm just give up the notion of ever finishing. I'm just writing these 2 pages today.
What do you think literature and just the access to it can do for people in rural places, or not only rural places, but people who just feel like maybe they're not represented in the mainstream culture?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think that one of the important things is, I think that we live in a time now when when everyone can have a voice, that there is a place for to publish for all of our voices, even if it's going to be done online or if it's self-publishing. And there are all kinds of ways to get the stories out there. I do think it's really important because I come from, even though I grew up in Bartlesville, my roots are in that rural culture in southeastern Oklahoma, and they aren't represented. When I first began to write, it was Faulkner who told me, and Flannery O'Connor, who helped me realize that the people I come from are worth writing about, because they get, they showed me the size of their lives by showing the size of the lives of the white Southerners that they came from. And so I think that finding a way to get the stories out there of the truth of your own individual life is vital for people in really anywhere. I mean, the same thing can be said, for an inner city in, I don't know, Cincinnati. I mean, they're all kinds of places. Not all literature happens in New York and Los Angeles. Right. Most movies happen in New York and Los Angeles. And it doesn't all happen in a dystopian world either. That's the thing that I get a little frustrated with sometimes with the young people that I see who are wanting to write. They mostly read speculative fiction, dystopian fiction. There was a whole era when it was vampires, and there was a whole era zombies, and it goes through what it does, but it's never about their real lives. They don't own the dignity and significance of their lives and the people that they come from. And so that would be the thing that I would encourage people who aspire to write to look to their own lives in that way. And I also think that that's the thing when you say what value it can have. There's also great value for us to read European literature and Chinese literature, and we can know about the world in that way as well. And there's great value for that kid growing up in Red Oak, or that kid growing up in Bartlesville as I was, to read A Separate Peace and Lord of the Flies and all those books and Silas Marner, that we read back in those days, because they give you a deep, rich understanding of what it means to be human. But if you can couple that with regional literature from your region, so that you can go, oh, yes, my life matters too, our lives matter too, and make sure that regional literature is not stereotyped, and that it in fact speaks to the truth of who the people are there, you can make some art.
And speaking of that, 2012, you gave a speech at the Women Writers Museum in DC. I think I looked at this interview you did with Theresa Miller. Can you tell me about some of the women from Oklahoma that you mentioned?
Well, I was thinking at that time, one of the first big influences on me was Angie Debo, who's a wonderful historian as well. You will know who Angie Debo is, and probably most of our listeners will know who she was. And her work, especially her writings about the five tribes and the truths that she told, were really important to me when I first began to try to understand and uncover Oklahoma's true story. And also her courage, which I did not know when I first read her books. I mean, she was just this famous historian to me. I didn't understand that, how much adversity came against her because she told the truth and because she was a woman. And then some of the other women Oklahoma writers that have really meant a great deal to me, Theresa Miller is one, and she's been such a powerful force for so many Oklahoma writers, as a writer, but also as director of the Center for Oklahoma Poets and Writers for so many years, and also the wonderful, gracious host of Writing Out Loud. And so she's, and also her work, Remnants of Glory, and she's in her memoir. And so she's been a powerful influence. Probably the two biggest influences I don't know if I would call them influences. They're just really significant to me. One is Joy Harjo and the other is Leanne Howe. We're all of the same generation. Their work, Joy's work as a poet, her work as a memoirist, her work as a musician. And Leanne is just a force of nature. I mean, she writes fiction and poetry and plays and scholarly articles. And she's just, film. She's just amazing. And also just a wonderful. And their vision of of Oklahoma, and Leanne's Choctaw, Joy is Skokie and Creek, and they give a real authentic vision of what this place is in a way that is neither sentimental nor it's not the master narrative. And so they're always telling a kind of truth. I think that they don't only write about Oklahoma, but they write out of Oklahoma because they both grew up here. So those are two others who've been really powerful influences on me. I love Billy Letz's work, and her as an individual. She was so funny and warm and committed, and she was a great activist. My husband and I went in the build-up to the Iraq War. We joined a peace and justice organization in upstate New York, and we went to a lot of those huge demonstrations and marches, hoping to prevent the Iraq War, which of course did not happen. We were in the biggest one of them all in Washington, D.C., marching in this huge press of hundreds of thousands of people. Look over, and there's Billy Letts. Just, I think she was there by herself. I don't even know how she got there. Yeah, marching along. We just had a great grand reunion of Oklahoma writers in the middle of that march in Washington, D.C. So I think that those are probably some of the people. There's so many writers who don't yet have a lot of recognition. I mean, thinking about Carol Johnson and so several others who are publishing. Mm-hmm. Well, and then there's Janetta Calhoun-Mish, who's our current poet laureate, and Connie Squires, and there's just so many wonderful Oklahoma women writers who are out there telling the truth.
Yeah, gotta read them. What are the biggest challenges women who write face?
That's a good question as well. I think that the challenges that women who write face are I am not knocking at the door of American letters. So I think if I were, my frustrations would be enormous. Mm-hmm. But I'm not. I'm looking to tell us about us. And so I don't feel a particular kind of frustration that I think some others might feel. I do think that there's a patriarchy that exists in this land. That's another wound. We could go off on that other tangent and spend a lot of time there. And I think that it's true. It's authentically true. When you look at the big prizes, the big literary prizes that more often won by men. And but the readers are primarily women, and that's I know that's my audience. That's not to say that men don't read my work; they do, but the primary readers of my work, as long as I'm not unable to get my work published and out there because I'm a woman, and so far that has not been the case, then I'm okay with being. Okay, here's an example. For the reviews for Kind of Can, they were, I got was a lot of nice notice and those kinds of things. But there was one reviewer who's a man who's from the East Coast who talked about, he was really dismissive of the lives of the white rural characters, particularly that character, that Aunt Sweet. He said, I kept waiting for her to, get out of the 1950s. And I was going, you've never been to rural southeastern Oklahoma, have you? And so he was dismissive. He wanted the book to be a different kind of book than what it is, and he wanted it to be, I don't know, I think because it was dealing with immigration and so forth. So I could feel that the readers will say to me, she is just like me. She's a woman, or she's just like my sister, or she's just like my aunt, or she's just like my cousin. Women with not enough money, not enough education, trying to keep their families together, things falling apart, problems with drug addiction, kids who won't act right, child growing up to be a bully, all those things. And her life was not important to that reviewer. But it matters to the people who read it. It matters to me. And so I could say that that's one of the problems that a woman writer might face, is that her subject matter might be considered domestic, or it might be considered unimportant. That is classic. That goes back eons, way past, before there was an America, much less an Oklahoma. So I don't worry about that stuff. Not to say that it's not there, it is there. Not to say that I haven't got time to fight that battle, because that's not the battle that I'm not knocking at the door. But I want somebody else to do it. I'm not saying it doesn't need to be done. It's just not mine, because I know who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And everyone has a different perspective on that. So how do you want your work to be remembered? I'm just thinking of just your body of work and what it says about Oklahoma and America and just our history and humanity.
That's good. I think that I feel as if I'm always looking to do two things: interpret Oklahoma to the rest of the country, and by extension, you could say, elsewhere beyond these shores. But I have some readership in Europe, but it's not great. It's not vast. But I want to be so telling the truth about who we are and what our story is, that we recognize ourselves, that readers say, yes, that's me too. And also that it is that who we are moves beyond the stereotype of whatever stereotyped image people do. And they do have stereotypes about Oklahoma. Well, they don't even know where we are. Actually, they just, for the most part, it's like in the middle somewhere. And so I, she told the truth. I think that's the thing that, if somebody was going to say, what would you want your epitaph to be? That would be it. But it matters more to me that readers in Oklahoma see a truth in what I've written than it matters to me that people outside looking at my work, whether they see it or not, then I'm good either way. It's fine. So I think that's primarily it. And I also think that I would really hope that what I write gives at some point or in some way gives an opportunity for the dignity and the power, both of who we are as a people and of also what has happened, the magnificence of the story that is Oklahoma, to have resonance and power, to not be a place that people think they know and they don't know. So that's a vast ambition. And I think that's a body of work, really. Yeah. That's not just my work, that's all the work that's coming out of this place. So that includes a lot of other writers too.
Yeah, that's great. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I can't think of anything. I'd like to just come up with some pithy little note to end it on, but I'm not sure that I could think of anything.
She told the truth is pretty good.
Yeah, she told the truth.
All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thanks.